Hello there, my name's Andy Skinner and I'm one of the learning team at Tudor House and Garden. In this online talk, I'm going to speak a little bit about the history of Tudor House. The house in many ways reflects, echoes, it ties into the broader history of Southampton. So although I'll be talking mainly about the stories contained within the walls of the house, you can't go far before you having to start talk about other things as well. The house itself, although it's called Tudor House, it actually goes back much further than that. It's about 800 years old, and the oldest part of the house is right at the back. When you next visit, you'll find yourselves, if you keep going into the back, into a large kind of ruin area, and this is known as King John's Palace. We've had one king called John in England, only one. He wasn't particularly popular, and he never visited Tudor House, as far as we know. King John probably refers to one of the owners in the 14th century, a man called John Whitgod, and he was a merchant. And to understand Tudor House's place in Southampton, you need to know about merchants, because Southampton was really a merchant maritime community during the medieval period. So at this point, where Tudor House is, was pretty much on the waterline. So you'd walk out of King John's Palace and you'd be met with the quays. And so you'd have all sorts of different trading vessels coming into Southampton, selling their wares. Lots of interesting things. I mean, wine and wool are the main things, but by about 1300, you're finding interesting new exotic spices coming in, things like aniseed, expensive linens from Germany and places like that are coming too, soap. And they're all coming into this area where there are lots of merchant houses. Under the houses, there would have been vaults as well for the storing of wine. And somebody like John Whitgood, he's got a warehouse, which is where King John's Palace is. Barrels of wine would be rolled out of doorways straight onto the quay, or vice versa, coming in from the quay, and it makes Southampton a real kind of booming economy during the 13th mainly century, so sort of 1200s or so. And for somebody like John Whitgood in Tudor House, his warehouse, so the place where he stores all of his produce, is on the ground floor, and then on top of that, he's got a living accommodation as well, which has things like a fireplace, which seems quite unusual at the time. So experts in those sorts of fields get quite excited by it when they see our fireplace. So he lives there, and he's living there at a time that's pretty important in Southampton's history, because he's around during 1338. And I won't say too much, except to say that in 1338, Southampton was raided, devastatingly so, by French, Sicilian and Genoese pirates. And they came and they burned a lot of the buildings to the ground. They stole a lot of the wealth of the town. And it was after this point that the King of England at the time, Edward III, ordered that walls be built around the town, defensive walls, and many of those are still around today. The whole walls were huge, over a mile in length, sometimes 20 foot high. There were 29 towers, about 8 gates. So it's a very well fortified town, but actually for the merchants that's not so good, because all those gates that we were talking about, those doorways, those arches that the produce can be rolled through, are now blocked up to make the walls. And actually King John's Palace, the outer wall, becomes part of the town defences from that. So the economy of Southampton, suffers enormously because of this. It takes about 100 years for it to pick up to pre-raid levels. Pretty important event. But we've still got merchants in this space, and the part of Tudor House that you would now look around when you visit was 3 different houses, each owned by somebody else. And it's in the 15th century that things start changing, and it becomes a much larger house. Tying in quite interestingly with the War of the Roses, because in the 1480s, which is when Richard III is on the throne, he wasn't king for very long, only about 18 months or so. But he didn't like the owner of Tudor House, a man called Watkin William. And Watkin William had to flee, and he fled to Beaulieu Abbey, where he died. Richard III, as probably everybody knows, was defeated in battle by the man who would become King Henry VII, the first of the Tudors. And Henry gave Tudor House to his supporters. And it's at this point that a man takes over the house called John Daltrey. He's an important Tudor, a man who seemed to have fingers in many different pies. And he established the house as one large house. And he made lots of interesting changes. For example, he is the person who creates a banqueting hall. He also looks at the cellars where before then the wine had been stored, and he turns it into the kitchens, and the fireplaces from that time still survive. It must have been a pretty impressive building, to the extent that when the museum opened in 1912, when you buy the guidebook, it had a bit of information, and it sort of said, well, Henry VIII visited Tudor House with his queen Anne Boleyn. It can't be true. It's very unlikely to be true, I think. I'd love it if it was. But so Tudor House, pretty important. And subsequently we find other important owners. And actually there's a link between all of the owners around this time, and that is actually their wife, because it was the same person, a lady called Isabel. And Isabel was married 3 times to 3 different owners of Tudor House. And we think we know what she looked like because Hans Holbein did a portrait of a lady he called the Lady Lister. We can't be completely sure it's her, but I like to think it is. One of the other owners was a man called Richard Lister, and actually there's a monument to him in St Michael's Church. So next time you're there, pop in. I think you'll be able to have a look at his monument. So she's married to these different owners. Really interesting the way that ownership passed at that time. Very different to today. So what was Tudor House like at that time? Well, we have an inventory from 1570. So this is during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And Tudor House was occupied by a man called Arthur Pitt. He was a ship owner, and he was a merchant, of course. Everybody was a merchant at that time. And it tells us that in Tudor House, amongst other things, of course, there was a parlour, a buttery, which was for storing wine, 3 chambers, 2 studies, 2 small cellars, a little court, and a little garden. So it seems like quite a prestigious place to live. But the thing about Tudor House is that it always seems to go up and down, the fortunes of the house. Because at the end of the Elizabethan period, from about 1570 to 1620, we find loads of really interesting graffiti. Etchings of all sorts of things, like ships, animals, people, names, all sorts of things, basically. And you've got to ask yourself, why would you find graffiti in a really prestigious house? And the simple answer is, you wouldn't. Not like this, anyway. So the presumption is that Lots of people may be staying at Tudor House at this time. The ships are particularly interesting because if this graffiti goes up to 1620, what else left Southampton in 1620? The answer is the Mayflower. I'm not saying that the people who sailed on the Mayflower lived at Tudor House or stayed at Tudor House. It's unlikely, but it is possible. And what it also gives us a really interesting glimpse at are the types of people that we find when the Mayflower leaves in 1620, 400 or so years ago. So Tudor House not doing quite as well as it had done in previous centuries, it's fair to say. And then over time, continues to kind of do this. For example, in the Georgian period, a wealthy owner, a man called George Rogers, worked for the Admiralty, but was also a painter, an amateur painter, pretty good. He was quite an accomplished painter in his own right. And it's during this time that Southampton, again, we're echoing the fortunes of the town, is doing pretty well because it opened as a spa town, a spa resort where they built all sorts of new interesting buildings. They imported lots of paving slabs and things to gentrify the area, made a bathhouse close by. And then we have the establishment of the docks in the 19th century. And you'd imagine that that would bring great fortune to the town. But actually, it sort of has the opposite effect in the area where Tudor House is, because it becomes really kind of like a slum area. Lots of pubs, lots of destitution. You could say that there was the red light district just round the corner as well. And so Tudor House was scheduled for demolition. And at that time there was a man called William Spranger, who was the sort of philanthropist, the type you only really got then. He was involved in lots of different things for the town. He lived up on Hill Lane in a place called Spring Hill Court, near to where Spring Hill School is today. And he bought the house and turned it into a museum. Not straight away. It was a private museum, and then finally the corporation, Southampton Corporation, bought the house and turned it into the first museum in 1912. And the 20th century saw some pretty important events in Southampton. Right in the middle, the Second World War, the vault underneath the museum was turned into an air raid shelter, and actually the curator was one of the air raid precaution wardens as well. So there's that angle into the history of Tudor House as well. Quite a few changes were made. For example, the big one was that Spranger wanted to make Tudor House look as Tudor-y as possible. There's a bit of a Disney effect. He added a minstrel's gallery in the banqueting hall. There hadn't been one there before, but he thought, well, that's what the Tudors had, so we'll add one too. Added lots of new doorways as well, and that actually made the house a little bit unstable. And so by the 1980s, the survey that was conducted, it very poetically said that the house was opening like the petals of a flower. And so the house had to be closed at the beginning of this century. It was closed for quite a period of time, nearly a decade, but it reopened in 2011 for the house to be enjoyed today. So there's a bit of a whistle stop there of the history of Tudor House. A fantastic building. Do visit us. And thanks very, very much for watching.